This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and this is the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
The story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of this usually weekly podcast is to talk, as the title suggests, of the stories of film. So I tend to look at production stories, development stories, marketing stories, just those little tales that go to make the films that we know and love, or sometimes not love so much. Just that, really. What is it that makes those films those films? This episode of the podcast is coming to you after our annual summer break, so we've been away for a couple of weeks. For those of you who binge it or just pick individual episodes, that'll mean absolutely nothing to you. For those who follow this podcast weekly, and bless you all, then thank you for coming back. I've got two films we're going to talk about, as always, in this episode, and the first one is a hugely popular one, one of the most loved Star Trek films that's ever been made, and it doesn't even have Star Trek in the title. Without further ado, here's a clip, and I'm going to take you through the story the other side of this.
Alexander Day! Yeah! Alright!
My grandfather's hammer, you shall be avenged.
Yeah! Alright! Okay, now. And finally...
By Grabthar's hammer. What a savings.
All right. Yeah, let's hear it.
Well, you don't need me to tell you just how much missed the late great Alan Rickman is, but there he is in wonderful form in 1999's Galaxy Quest, directed by Dean Parasut. This one, the original story came from David Howard, and the final screenplay was credited to Howard and to Robert Gordon. The cast, well, led by Tim Allen and Sigourney Weaver, with Alan Rickman, Tony Shalhoub, Sam Rockwell, Daryl Mitchell in there. You get Missy Paul and Justin Long in his first screen role as well, his first big screen role. But the origins of this particular film, which was voted by Star Trek fans at a convention as I think it was something like the 6th or 7th best Star Trek film, which tells you just how much love and affection is both in it and there is for it. It lies with David Howard, who was in that list of credits back then. Now, Howard actually penned a spec script. For those of you who don't know, that's where it's not a script it is literally, I use literally, terrible. It is where you write a script on spec that hasn't been paid for or anything like that and send it out in the hope that it will get made. And Howard got that screenplay to DreamWorks, which towards the late 1990s, this was the early years of DreamWorks, and it had to come up with a slate of motion pictures. Relatively quickly. So the script was there, and that's where it was discovered by a producer called Mark Johnson. Now, Johnson at this point had a development deal in place with DreamWorks. The script at that stage was going by the name of Captain Starshine, and Mark Johnson read it and didn't like it. But the one thing he really did like, and the one thing he really locked into, was this central idea of aliens misconstruing a science fiction TV series for the real thing, and more to the point, misconstruing the fact that the actors in the TV series were the real thing. And so with that nugget, really, he took that to another screenwriter by the name of Robert Gordon. And what happened is Gordon didn't actually read the original script that David Howard had put together, but he penned his version based around that singular idea that producer Mark Johnson had locked into. And as a consequence, the script came together, and it came together and attracted a high-profile director as well, because the original had fate taken a different turn. The original director named on Galaxy Quest to direct, I'm sure it went through one or two other hands before, was the late great Harold Ramis. And I did a podcast previously on Groundhog Day. Cleverly, I didn't put it out on Groundhog Day, which did delve into how involved Harold Ramis got with the screenplay of that film and developing the script after the original screenwriter Danny Rubin had put it together. And so when you've got Ramis on board, a brilliant writer, he gets involved with the screenplay, he gets involved with the development. DreamWorks, as I said, was shy of pictures, and it was keen to fast track the movie and get Galaxy Quest moving. As such, even as the script development continued, the eye was moving on to casting and just who do you put in these lead roles in the film. And DreamWorks wanted Tim Allen to take on the role of Jason Nesmith, effectively the William Shatner character in the movie. And the problem there was Harold Ramis wasn't keen. And there's an excellent article on the MTV website, which is a Galaxy Quest oral history looking back at all of this. And it talked about how Ramis couldn't really land the cast that he wanted for the project. So an offer at one point went into Alec Baldwin to take on that lead role. And Baldwin, I think the offer went to him and then was withdrawn. And he was interested in it. But also in the mix were Steve Martin and Kevin Kline. And in fact, an offer went out to Kevin Kline. The reason Kline turned it down was not a dislike of the material. It was the fact that the film was to shoot in Los Angeles. Kline was then based in New York, and it wasn't logistically possible or desirable for him at that point to spend several months away. So, with DreamWorks pushing towards Tim Allen, Ramis eventually backed away from the movie. I mean, there were other names in the mix for some of the supporting roles in Galaxy Quest. So, Paul Rudd was in there, Jennifer Coolidge, Kieran Culkin, Tom Everett Scott. But ultimately, the offer to lead the film went to Tim Allen. That said, Tim Allen had a choice to make, because he was, at this point, he was a rising movie star. Toy Story is one, of course, but don't forget just how successful the Santa Claus movies were. He'd obviously got a huge profile off TV, and Tim Allen was in demand as a lead comedy actor. As such, he was offered the film Bicentennial Man. You might remember this. It ultimately got made with Robin Williams in the lead role. I think directed by Chris Columbus, and a pretty odd and unfunny film, I found, Bicentennial Man. Nonetheless, Alan was juggling between that and one or two other projects as well that didn't come to fruition. But he ultimately nudged towards Galaxy Quest. There is a story in there that he was persuaded to a degree by Kevin Spacey, of all people, to take the role on. But with Alan on board, along came next the new director for the movie, and that director was Dean Paraset. And he, in turn, he's a huge Star Trek fan, and his appointment started to alter the direction of the film. Nonetheless, to give you an idea of what kind of tone they were going for, they were quite clear about what they didn't really want were science fiction stars in the film. They didn't want actors primarily known for their science fiction work, and as a consequence, Sigourney Weaver was not on the list to take on the role of Gwen DeMarco in the movie. She wasn't on the shortlist, and it was when Sigourney Weaver read the script, and then she talked to an agent, and her agent said no, they're looking for people with no sci-fi links. Weaver was just coming off making Alien Resurrection around this time as well, but she insisted. She pushed her name forward, and she got the role and would go on to have so much fun with it. Alan Rickman, his casting, he came in as Alexander Dane. I think he's credited as Sir Alexander Dane in the end credits of the movie as well. And the story there was that Rickman didn't like the idea that his character had been knighted and didn't feel it really worked or should be referenced in the film. So that was pulled back. But nonetheless, the knighthood remained in the end credits of the movie. He was attracted by the script. The script apparently very, very, just very good, very strong. And whilst there was a little bit of a perception from time to time, I've just read this on the outskirts really, that he might have come across a little bit grumpy on set. He was just playing into the role, and he always talked with such affection about Galaxy Quest. In fact, the shooting of Galaxy Quest, I mean, it was notorious really for Tim Allen playing an awful lot of pranks and being, you know, very Tim Allen when the film was being made. And there was a sense really throughout that this was a really fun ensemble movie to make, that they did all have an awful lot of fun doing it. But that said, there were changes as the film was shooting, and then there were significant changes to come when the film was in post-production. So let's go back to the fact that this was a DreamWorks production. DreamWorks was, and again, this was DreamWorks in its infancy. It was called DreamWorks SKG. So the S stood for Spielberg, the K for Katzenberg, Jeffrey Katzenberg, and then the G for David Geffen. So Steven Spielberg was to a degree hands-on, but certainly very involved with DreamWorks live-action slate, and he was keen really for it to be a filmmaker-supportive studio. And Galaxy Quest was one of the early beneficiaries of that, which is why Dean Parisot, who freely admitted not the most visually ambitious, striking director at this point, was able to shift the shooting ratio of the movie some 20 minutes into it. There is a technical shift in the way that the film was presented, and people like Spielberg were there to be able to back that. Spielberg did visit the set just once, goes the story, and Justin Long, for one, credits this to the reason that his own role in the movie was beefed up and made bigger. So Justin Long plays the fan Brandon, and Spielberg pointed out that they needed a character really to link the film to fans, and thus as a consequence the character of Brandon was beefed up, and Justin Long is in the film more than was originally intended. Likewise, Missy Paul's character Laliari, her character was beefed up at the suggestion of Spielberg too. The character of Fred Kwan, played by Tony Shalhoub, was also one that evolved a lot during filming. That there was a feeling as the film was shooting that it wasn't really working on the page, and so the actor and director worked together consistently to beef up the role and change lines throughout, which obviously the rest of the ensemble had to react to and worked with. But there was another problem throughout the production of the movie that they kind of had to contend with, and they had to work with, and that was the Galaxy Quest as a film, as we know it, is clearly a love letter and a half to Star Trek, and clearly the look and feel of the show within the film is heavily influenced by Star Trek, but there were legitimate fears during the making of the movie that the production would be sued if they got too close to the look of Star Trek. And this is why you don't see sci-fi staples like tractor beams in the film, or that you don't get any beaming up. But even when they were designing the actual set for the movie, they had to be really careful as much what it didn't look like as much as what it did. What they didn't want to do is put a set on screen that was close enough to alert lawyers for Paramount Pictures, because Paramount has been relatively litigious with regards to Star Trek properties in the past, and so they were always treading a bit of a line there. Again, just referring back to a previous Film Stories podcast I did, I touched on this with Rango, that there's a character in Rango that's clearly Clint Eastwood driving around in a golf buggy with Oscar statues clinking in the back of said buggy. And in the case of that film, what they did is they just kind of figured it was affectionate, and because it was a degree of parody, that they would be covered and they wouldn't hit a problem, and they won that gamble. And it was the same really with Galaxy Quest in the end, but nonetheless the fear was a legitimate one, and the fear was very much there. In terms of studio interference though, DreamWorks at this point, its big project, and the one that it was pouring all of its the bulk of its time and resources into in live action, was Gladiator. That was going on at the same time, and as a result the corporate eyes weren't really on Galaxy Quest an awful lot. Now, the environment they were creating at DreamWorks of course meant that even if the eyes had been on it, they wouldn't necessarily have interfered an enormous amount, but nonetheless there was a degree of freedom in shooting the movie. The problem, though, was when they'd wrapped the film up and when they locked a cut together and had a look at it, it was a much darker beast, and it was a much more profane beast as well. And in fact, when it was submitted to the ratings board, just to get some guidance on it, the first rating that the Motion Picture Association of America came back with for Galaxy Quest was an R rating, and the film was originally ultimately released with a PG, although in hindsight, director Dean Parasetter said he wished it had been a PG-13 because then they'd have been able to leave in a Sigourney Weaver F-bomb gag. But it was an interview I found with the website Collider with the film's producer Lindsay Collins, where she said, quote, "It was the director's cut and it was R-rated and everybody was swearing and there were sex scenes and the whole thing. They didn't know what to do with it, so they had to re-edit the whole thing and make it what it is today." And that's the situation they found themselves in. That both Tim Allen and Dean Parasetter have subsequently admitted too, that the tone was originally much tougher, that it took real test screenings to really tune the film and decide to go for a more family-friendly and comedic tone, which is ultimately where the film went, of course. But for a good while, it wasn't there. It was further away. And in fact, if you watch the film, because they did quite a lot of ADR, which is the dubbing new lines over the original sound recording, they did quite a lot of ADR work to take some of the profanities and swear words out of the movie. And if you watch the film and just watch the lips of the actors, sometimes you can tell that they're saying on set something completely different to the words that are coming out of their mouths. It's not just it's not just language either. I mean, one of the earlier drafts of Galaxy Quest had, when the ship lands in the convention hall in the original draft, it was going to decapitate a bunch of people. There was stuff originally written where Sigourney Weaver's character would try and seduce some of the aliens, and it was cut out, but that's why her shirt is ripped towards the end of the film. It was for a sequence that wasn't actually in there. The movie, though, was shaped into the final cut that we know today. There is talk, incidentally, of that they've just announced a 20th anniversary, 20 years old. They've just announced a 20th anniversary Blu-ray release of Galaxy Quest. And the question instantly comes up, will all this R-rated footage be put back in or made available? And the answer is likely to be a no to that. But it's pretty well known that material is out there. And this isn't mysterious footage that's been disappeared and locked away. This clearly exists. Nonetheless, the film was released in American cinemas in December of 1999, and it was a solid hit. However, it wasn't a huge hit. There was a feeling that there was a bigger commercial take that could have been made here had the marketing of the movie been a little bit different. So just looking at the numbers, I mean, the film cost $45 million to make, and in America it grossed $71 million, which is a decent return on that. Overseas, it only took 19 for an overall box office of $90 million. And it would be fair to say that's not really reflective of just how well loved the film is today. But the film kind of had to grow and grow and grow. It became a DVD and a fan hit, really. But on its original release, the marketing for it was tepid. There was some stuff. There was some fun stuff. I mean, they did a Galaxy Quest website that was deliberately all broken and HTML-y, kind of old style feel, and that was good. And they did making of bits and bobs. But what they didn't really do is convey the film to a broader audience, particularly. And such was the feeling that the marketing wasn't right, that Jeffrey Katzenberg of DreamWorks rang director Dean Parasetter up after a week or two to apologise for not selling the movie better, that the problem wasn't the film, the problem was the way that they promoted it. Thankfully, the audience found Galaxy Quest and continues to salute Galaxy Quest to the point where we do get 20th anniversary disc releases, and a point where the decline of physical media makes that no guarantee whatsoever. There was also talk for quite a while of a sequel to Galaxy Quest, and more recently a television series spin-off of it. The sequel, the big screen sequel talk really just, it just quietly went away when the world tragically lost Alan Rickman at a depressingly early age. And whilst there continues to be rumblings of a television spin-off series, it kind of got a little bit stuck between various companies who may or may not make it. In terms of Rickman, I mean, he's such a delightful performance in the film. And of course, there's that iconic line that he says, the "by Grabthar's hammer" line that I played you a clip of right at the start. And beautifully, it was just a temporary line. It wasn't anticipated when it was first written to be the final line that was used in the movie, but it was just it just sounded so wonderfully silly, and really in Rickman's hands worked a treat, and they just started using it during the film. They made t-shirts, and it just kind of sunk in, and the decision was made to keep the line in, and I and many others are very glad that they did. And one coda on it, really, that again, the late Harold Ramis, who had pushed back really against the casting of Tim Allen, and it was the casting was one of the main reasons that led him to walk away from the project. When he saw the final film, he admitted the eventual casting of the film was spot on, and it sounds of it, he was as much a huge fan of the movie as the rest of us. And just to ice the cake, that rest of us includes pretty much the cast of Star Trek as well, with the likes of Patrick Stewart, George Takei, William Shatner, all declaring their love and admiration of Galaxy Quest. And I just love how it goes to prove you can make a really funny comedy that's just got warmth and heart and charm and humanity and just kindness at the heart of it. Galaxy Quest, I for one am picking up that 20th anniversary disc. I suspect I'm not alone. And with that, we land at the halfway point of the New Film Stories podcast. So I'm going to just do a few plugs. I have a book out, if you could support it, or perhaps add it to your cart and maybe even buy a copy. It's called The Secret Life of Movies. You can find an awful lot of that about that over at the Film Stories website, filmstories.co.uk, where you can also pick up, we've got 2 new magazines since I last did a podcast. Issue 8 of Film Stories is led by the brilliant Jason Isaacs, where he gives me all sorts of stories on the likes of Event Horizon, Armageddon, through to his latest film, Hotel Mumbai. Film Stories Junior, what I think is the world's first print magazine by and for young film fans, is also available to order there as well. If you like this podcast, please leave a review. Please leave a really good review. I mean, that would help me enormously. And please also subscribe to it, because these things just help small independent publishers such as me just get a little bit more noticed. One more plug, I'm going on tour. Film Stories Live will be me in a series of venues around the UK, just warbling on about films for an hour and a bit, and then I'll be afterwards to talk to and sign magazines and books. If you want your magazines and books devalued by my signature, you can find full details of that on the Film Stories website in the live dates tab. It's at filmstories.co.uk, and that's all the plugs done, and I'm going to get on with another film. And that second film is a comedy that, sometimes you have a comedy that is just your go-to when you've had a not great time or a really long week or something like that, and you just want something that's reliably going to entertain you. This, for me, the film I'm about to talk about, is the best one that the noughties, the first decade of the 2000s, threw up. So let's have about the tamest clip I could possibly find, and I'll come to the story the other side of that.
First time with the program?
Oh, God, really? Wheeler, switch with me.
No way, dude.
Martin Gary. I can always spot a newbie. It's my 5th year with Wings. I guess Paul McCartney's got nothing on me, huh? Love, take me down to the streets.
It's not a Wings song.
Yeah, it's one of their hits from the 70s. I'm not sure which one.
It's not.
It isn't?
No.
I think it might be.
That's not. Nobody sings that song.
I don't know about that. I'll have to Google
That's
it.
right, some kids.
And that there is about the most family-friendly clip I could get from 2008's Role Models, directed by David Wayne. Original story for this one came from Timothy Dowling and W. Blake Heron. Screenplay eventually credited to Paul Rudd and David Wayne and Ken Marino and Timothy Dowling. The cast for this one, meanwhile, Paul Rudd and Sean William Scott, along with Christopher Mintz-Plasse, Elizabeth Banks, Banks, Jane Lynch, Bobby J. Thompson, Ken Jeong, also in the really impressive ensemble for the film. And this was an R-rated comedy that came together really quite quickly, but not without some bumps in the road. Quite useful for the purposes of this podcast. It was actually announced for the first time at the end of December 2006 by Universal, and this was an era for Universal where you kind of offset your big expensive blockbusters with cheaper R-rated comedies in your schedule, and the R-rated comedies were delivered. I mean, the template around the time was Wedding Crashers, which had done substantive amounts of money, and these were much more economic films to make, and they were not particularly tricky or taxing ones to make either. As a consequence, the studios and Universal doubled down really on them, were keen to pursue them. And so the original script for this one was penned by Timothy Dowling, and at that point the film went by the name of Big Brothers, and Luke Greenfield was down to direct. Now, by the time Greenfield, in fact, had signed up to direct the movie, it had already gone through lots of writers and different versions. So Greenfield had made a hit movie called The Girl Next Door, which, again, R-rated comedy, starring Elisha Cuthbert, and that was a pretty raunchy film that it particularly broke through on home formats and was a DVD hit. So he was set up at the production company New Regency. In fact, he'd go on to do a film called Let's Be Cops as well that was far less successful. And it was him. Greenfield was really the one who was credited with actually getting the film set up in the first place. Dowling, incidentally, would go on to write a couple of Adam Sandler vehicles, Just Go With It and Pixels, but here this was pretty much at the start of his feature writing career. Not that he would stay on the credits for too long, which I'll come to in a second. The story goes that the film in these earlier drafts and earlier guises was actually more of a drama, and then it gradually migrated into a comedy. I couldn't quite fully get to the nub of that, but there was certainly a more serious angle to it at one point, so it seems. But ultimately, this whole idea of a couple of characters who face jail, who take on community service work, working with young children, was always the heart of the movie, and the idea being that these two people mentor young kids as part of what becomes known in the film as Sturdy Wings organisation. By the start of 2007, this wasn't long after Universal had first announced the movie, the website Chud was reporting that the script was now by two different writers who weren't ultimately credited, Moses Port and David Garaccio, and by this point it was an R-rated comedy. Paul Rudd, one of the first members of the cast to be on board was Sean William Scott at this point, but it was Paul Rudd really who was the next catalyst for pushing it all forward. So Rudd came aboard in the middle of 2007, and Luke Greenfield at that point departed the project not long thereafter. The film was in pre-production at the point where Greenfield left the movie, and thus it didn't have a director. So as well as Rudd and Sean William Scott, Bobby J. Thompson was already in at that point, but the clock was ticking on getting this film made, and the script wasn't right, and there was the upcoming threat of a writer's strike coming as well, which I'm going to touch on shortly. So Rudd was busy rewriting the script, and it was he who suggested, having worked with him before, David Wayne, to come in and direct the movie. And David Wayne had just been making The 10, which he co-wrote with Ken Marino, so he brought Marino with him onto Role Models as well, and they were quickly on with the job of rewriting the screenplay and getting it into a place. Now Sean William Scott would say that he signed up at first to take on ultimately the role of Wheeler in the film that would become known as Role Models, because the character actually, sometimes actors say I did it because it's a very different role to the one I've played before. In this case, he sort of wanted to go back to the roles that he wanted to do before a little bit. So Sean William Scott sprung to fame playing Stifler in the American Pie films, and he'd gone off and done a couple of movies. He'd done Mr. Woodcock with Billy Bob Thornton, and he'd done the Dukes of Hazzard film, and Sean William Scott would say of the Dukes of Hazzard that it made a lot of box office but was the worst reviewed film of his career. I've interviewed him in the past, and I think he's someone who's fairly conscious of the reviews of his work, not in a beating himself up way, but takes genuine interest in the opinions on it. And in fact, what he told the Frat Pack website around the time of the film's release was, I need to find a movie that's going to make some money, that's going to be funny, and put a little bit of a different spin on a character that's allowed me to have a career. And he cited Wedding Crashers again, and Vince Vaughn's performance in Wedding Crashers as his template about how Vince Vaughn was able to take the character that he brought to life in Jon Favreau's Swingers and find a slightly different spin on that character. And that turned into Wedding Crashers, that in turn was an enormous hit, and really the launch of Vaughn's mainstream Hollywood career that would peter out subsequently. In terms of the further supporting cast, David Wayne in turn would help bring in the likes of Christopher Mintz-Plasse, Jane Lynch and Ken Jeong. And one of the things I really like about Role Models is that there are so many supporting roles that actually work, that have a point, that have substance, that come away are memorable. Not least the character of Ronnie, played by young Bobby J. Thompson, the foul-mouthed young kid in the film who pretty much steals every scene that he's in. Nonetheless, we're at the point where Rudd, Wayne and Ked Marino took that screenplay apart then. They put it back together, and it got to the point where the schedule was so tight that they just had to start shooting. They had to shoot something. As David Wayne would tell me when I interviewed him once in the past, there wasn't much time to overthink it. And in fact, it was a set with a lot of improvisation going on, but also it was up against this aforementioned Writers Guild of America strike that was going to kick off in 2007. So they had to get the formal rewrites in and written in time for that, and also they needed to shoot the film in 2007. There were all these deadlines crashing in. Wayne had come to the project quite late, and the wheels were moving, so they rewrote heavily on the fly, and they also improvised heavily on the fly. Now, Paul Rudd, it would actually turn out to be his first credited screenwriting work, and I mean, he gave an interesting interview where he said he ended up with more clout than he was actually expecting because it was his first credited writing work. He came up with the idea of the Minotaur Mobile that you see early in the film. It's the energy drink truck. And he said, "You write, oh, there's this thing called a Minotaur Mobile, and then there it is, and it clearly costs tens of thousands of dollars." And he described that as a weird kind of power. Also on set, there was the small matter of young Bobby J. Thompson, who plays the incredibly foul-mouthed Ben Affleck loathing child Ronnie in the movie. And there was an issue that, well, at least there was a concern in that here was a film that required a young performer to do an awful lot of cussing, an awful lot of swearing, and he did have a guardian alongside him, and Sean William Scott was improvising alongside him as well. And Sean William Scott was fairly open about the fact that he was doing a fair amount of cussing, and he was actually asked at one point to pull it back by the production team just because they were a little bit concerned. But in the end, he kind of reasoned, well, they read the script, they knew what he was getting into, and in fact Thompson was delivering lines as good as anyone in the film, and that's no slight on anyone in the film. He is one of the best young scene stealing performers I've ever seen, alongside the likes of Christina Ricci in the Addams Family film, certainly in a comedy movie. But there were, for all the improvisation opportunities that were in the film, there was one section of the movie that couldn't be improvised, and the film, without going into an awful lot of detail, its last act builds to a fairly extended battle sequence that happens between some of the characters in the movie, and that couldn't be improvised, even though it was hardly guns and swords and such like. There was a need for that to look right on film, and so the production hired a man called Jeff Imada, and he had just come off the back of choreographing the fights in films such as The Bourne Supremacy and The Bourne Ultimatum. He was arranging the fights for Matt Damon in those movies, and then he came in to Role Models to choreograph fights between the likes of Paul Rudd with toy swords, and again, I can't go into more detail than that. It's such a delightful end to the movie, but they did take that really, really seriously. Amongst the performers, going back to Sean William Scott, he did feel some kind of kinship with Christopher Mintz-Plasse, who was just coming off the back of Superbad at that point, and he said he remembers Mintz-Plasse asking him if William Scott had the experience with American Pie, where when the movie comes out, people suddenly recognise you, but recognise you as a character. But clearly, William Scott had gone through that. One other little tidbit that he threw in, Sean William Scott, was about the Minotaur costume that he had to wear in the movie. He absolutely loathed it and burned it as soon as the film was done. There was at one point, when it came to the marketing and promotion of the film, the idea of putting him in the Minotaur costume for billboards that may have gone in like to New York and Los Angeles. He was having absolutely none of that. I don't think it was being a difficult performer or anything like that. He just absolutely didn't want to do it. There was, I mean, the film as a whole was David Wayne's first studio project, and he'd come off The 10, which was a much smaller production. He'd come off the TV show Wet Hot American Summer, and whilst he knew his way around comedy, working his way around big studio films is a different matter. And so money was poured into the film in post-production for further reshoots. And in fact, Rudd had to go from the set of the film he did after straight back onto Role Models, because, again, they were trying to beat this writer's strike. They were trying to get all the production wrapped up by the middle of 2007, really, with the aim of getting the film in cinemas for April 2008. Although that ultimately didn't happen, because around the time of the middle of 2007, the idea with Role Models, bizarrely, was to put it out as a PG-13 comedy. That this R-rated comedy it was going through the post-production process, and there's a feeling that there was something softer in there. Fortunately, in this case, sanity prevailed. Reshoots took place. They left a lot of the improvisation in, and they started testing the movie and realised they got something, that the audience reaction to it was better than I think the studio was expecting. And so, in the end, whilst the film's release date was delayed, it was delayed to it was the same year, but it was delayed to November of 2008. Now, this in itself is slightly risky, because the R-rated comedies that the studios were putting out around this time were high summer films. They put them out in amongst the blockbusters, and putting them out somewhere towards a Christmas audience, they didn't really fit, as a rule, in that kind of release slot. In fact, by the time the film did come out in America, it opened opposite a DreamWorks family sequel, Madagascar, Escape to Africa. High School Musical 3 was in the charts at the time. There was still Saw 5 as a holdover from Halloween. But also, the following week, there was a Quantum of Solace. A Bond movie was following. Twilight was following. Disney's Bolt was following. And there wasn't an R-rated comedy in the midst of it all. But word of mouth kind of helped Role Models out here, that it opened with a really strong, all considering, $19 million opening weekend, a long way behind the Madagascar sequel, but it was enough to get second place in its opening weekend. And the film had cost $28 million to make. In the end, in the States, it would go on to make about $65-70 million. It had about another 25 overseas. So it wasn't a massive juggernaut hit, but again, this is one of those films that when it got to the video release, the DVD release, the Blu-ray release, it really did earn its numbers, and it really did find an audience. And it is one of those comedies, as I said right at the start, that just continues to deliver. Now, there were plans afoot at one stage to do a Role Models 2. Ideas were floated around there, but nothing really came to fruition. Most recently, Sean William Scott was last on the promotional trail for the Goon sequel a couple of years ago, and he kept getting asked about it, but the general feeling was that the studio R-rated comedies, they kind of swung away from that, and that it's now been 11 years since the first Role Models. Hollywood's hardly made a good fist of some of the belated sequels that it's done of late. I think this one is going to remain a one-off, but I do think it's an immensely fun one-off, and it is one of my go-to comedies. I think what's impressive about it as well is that really from start to finish, this all came together after it had been announced in just under 2 years, through a very muddled and rushed and troubled production against a backdrop of a strike, and yet they captured something. 99 times out of 100 it doesn't work. In the case of Role Models, I'd argue it really did. And that brings me to the end of the latest episode of Film Stories. You can find me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find the entire Film Stories project on Twitter at Film Stories Pod. If you want to see some of our video film stories that are exclusive to our YouTube channel, you can find them at youtube.com/film stories. The latest is some of the behind the scenes stories of Pulp Fiction. We're on Facebook as well. We hide there. You can find us there at facebook.com/film stories online. But with that, I'm going to leave you in peace. The summer break is over, so these podcasts will be coming back at you fairly regularly. And so I need to go off and prepare and research another one. And I thank you, as always, for your time and support. The very best to you, and you all take care. Bye-bye.